Welcome to the second to last week of Beck for this academic year. We actually have two upcoming Beck talks still to go. There's a special talk on Wednesday by Federico Rosano at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and his talk will be entitled Structure and Development of Gestural Communication in Great Apes. And then the final talk, that's on Wednesday at 12 in this room. The final talk for the year is Charles Perrault from UCLA Department of Anthropology, whose title of his talk is The Pace of Cultural Evolution, and that will be on Monday. The following Monday, the last Monday of the quarter, is Memorial Day, so we won't be meeting that week. The abstracts for both of those talks are on the website at beck.ucla.edu. And one final thing, these are the evaluations, so if you are registered for this class, please fill one out. Okay, and this week I am pleased to present Mary Shenk, who is coming from the University of Missouri, and her talk is entitled, Why Does Fertility Decline? So welcome, Mary.
I'd like to start by acknowledging my co-authors, Mary Towner, who's been involved with the analysis, a large portion of the analysis I'll be showing you, and also my student, Curtis Atkinson, who did the path analysis that I'll show you at the end of the talk. This talk, I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to talk about first. I'm going to talk about theory a little bit, theories, especially evolutionary theories of the demographic transition, but given this audience, I'm not going to belabor the point too much. I think what you'd rather see is the data. I'm going to talk about the study population. I'm going to show you some quantitative results. And then I'm going to have a section for discussion in which I talk about some of the complexities of determining causality with certain kinds of variables that I'm using, especially education. Talk some qualitative results and show you a preliminary path analysis that we're using to try to get at this question. And then we'll talk about conclusions and future directions. And ideally, I get some feedback from people here about how I'm doing these tests. So as almost I'm sure everyone here is aware, the demographic transition is a phenomenon that's been global over the last several hundred years. There are different ways of conceiving of it, but traditionally you start with a population that has high mortality and high fertility. You have a decline in in mortality followed by a decline in fertility, leading to lower rates of mortality and fertility in a remaining population. This doesn't characterize, of course, all populations, but what I'm going to be focusing on today is an aspect of this that's probably seeing the most attention, and that is the decline in fertility or the decline in birth rates, which is occurring in much of the world and is currently occurring in other parts of the world. So the demographic transition, one really, really heavily quoted idea from Vining's 1986 paper, in which he was critiquing sociobiological approaches in part, was that he called the demographic transition the central theoretical problem of human sociobiology, back when that was a common term. Since that time, there have been a lot of work on this topic in the evolutionary literature, especially in the 90s, and then a resurgence in the past 5 or 6 years, really quite a large amount of work. Some of this mirrors in some ways or reflects also literature, the non-evolutionary literature, which I won't talk about too much today, though I may mention a few people. But there's been, comparatively speaking, fewer comparative analyses, and that is especially fewer analyses that rigorously compare different models to get a sense of which models may be primary causes or stronger causes, or to get a relatively weight for different kinds of potential mechanisms for fertility decline. And so the work that I'm doing now is an attempt to get at especially this last point. And so this is one of the first couple of papers to come out of a project that I have. It's a 3-year NSF project called Evolutionary and Comparative Models of the Demographic Transition. What we're doing is testing evolutionary models that haven't been tested in some cases, comparing evolutionary and non-evolutionary models, and we're using, for the most part, not always, but model selection methods is one of the main reasons that we gave in the grant for what we would be bringing to this that was new. And so the data I'm going to be talking to you about today comes from fieldwork that I conducted 6 months in rural Bangladesh last year. And so when I talk about comparative, I'm really talking about comparing across models. We can later talk about potentially comparing between populations. So I'm going to be using a rubric in this talk which breaks evolutionary models and non-evolutionary models, potentially can also be seen in this way, into three main types. There are lots of models and lots of predictive variables that have been used as potential causes or motivators for the demographic transition. And because of that, I want to kind of focus on categories of causation rather than the specific details of particular models, which are rather complicated and they vary somewhat. So I'm going to be focusing on one kind of model that focuses on changing levels of risk or mortality. Oftentimes people talk about better healthcare or better nutrition, more sanitary living conditions, as allowing people better control over the number of children that survive and thus allowing for fewer children to be born in the first place or motivating fewer children to be born. The second kind of motivation I'm going to talk about is changing motivations for costs of parental investment. This could also include investment in self in some cases. And so a lot of people focus on different kinds of things, like education has received a lot of attention as a new form of parental investment, changing opportunity structures with integration into a market economy, or in a general sense, an emphasis or changing emphasis in investment in quality, over investment in quantity. And then finally, people who focused on changing cultural norms or various kinds of cultural transmission, including many things, but also including spread of reproductive technologies or new media, and changing family and residence patterns. The evolutionary people who have addressed these kinds of issues, at least the ones who are in these first two categories, often see this kind of change as either adaptive or that it would have been adaptive under past conditions. Whereas the cultural perspectives, not always, but frequently see this as modern fertility norms as frequently maladaptive or at least not necessarily adaptive. So in order to focus a little bit more specifically, I'm going to take each of these categories and talk to you briefly about some of the primary evolutionary models that have come out on these kinds of topics. So for risk models, models that focus on risk and mortality, James Chisholm has a lot of work that talks about that fertility should be reduced with decreases in local mortality rates or decreases in chronic social stress. Rob Quinlan, and drawing on work by other people, has talked about decreases in extrinsic or risk, and especially extrinsic mortality risk or risk that's not under the control of the individual as a cause. And he especially focuses on infancy and childhood, though I don't know that his data support that as ideally as he might like. Variance compensation, which is a model that's discussed by Leslie and Winterhalter, in which they essentially talk about that decreases in mortality rates, of course, should decrease, potentially cause decreases in fertility rates, but that especially decreases in the variance of mortality may be especially instrumental. And then if variance of mortality decreases, this may cause a more effective or important or lasting decrease in fertility than just decreases in the rates of mortality rates in general. And so in the last column, I've got some test variables that we could potentially use. And the ones that are in bolds are one that I'm either going to show you today or I'm going to actually talk about that we tested it and why we're not using it any longer. So you could, for instance, child and adult deaths in the household, child illness and food insecurity are the main ones I'm going to look at. There are a couple of others that I also show you. Investment models. Investment models, a few of the better known ones, probably embodied capital model by Hillard Kaplan has been something that a lot of people have read. He says that increases in payoffs for investment in self and children, which occur in wage labor economies, is essentially one of the primary mechanisms that drives fertility down. Though he also focuses on survival as well, which is more of a risk type model. And so measures of that would include education of the mother and father or potentially of the children. Also, access to or participation in national, international labor markets. Also occupation, type of occupation that people are engaged in. Ruth Mace has focused on the cost of children. This has also been reflected in some more recent work of hers with David Lawson. Increased costs of raising children, especially when wealth is heritable. And so I'm going to look at both of those aspects briefly at least. We can test the cost of education. We also look at heritable wealth in land and how changes in the amount of heritable wealth might affect changes in fertility. And then Lowe and some other people have focused on status competition. And she has argued that delaying childbearing, people essentially delay childbearing due to status competition, particularly revolving around things like education and certain attainment of certain occupations, etc. Some aspects of this model might also be considered a form of cultural transmission, which I'll talk about now. Cultural transmission, probably most famously Boyden Richardson's work, which actually looks at many things but uses the demographic transition as an example. Rather complicated in terms of they say a lot of things, but boiling it down to one of the major reasons for fertility reduction is that large number of high prestige adopters of low fertility, people who are engaging in prestige competition or engaging in high-paid, high-status work in modern economies. These are then, their behavior is then adopted by others through a process of prestige bias. And it suggests various kinds of indicators, potentially access to and use of media, especially increasing in a lot of modern contexts. I'm also going to look here at frequency of travel to cities and abroad as, again, a measure of one's exposure to these ideas. I'm going to look at women's education in this context. Women's education is one of the ways education is potentially both something that is about investment. Also, at the same time, there's a lot of enculturation or social transmission that occurs during education. And they suggest, and other people have suggested, that women's education may be more effective in this regard than men's. And I'm also going to look at intentional intervention, including things like family planning programs or things of that nature. Leslie Newson and some colleagues have also discussed a model that she calls the kin influence model, where essentially she argues that decreased interactions with kin in modern social contexts may essentially lead to lower fertility because people have less pronatal attitudes among non-kin than among kin. And so we'll look at the size of the natal and marital household and also some distance from natal marital household. There's also some other variables I could look at here, and I'll talk a little bit later about what we found in another talk. So as you've already gathered, I'm sure, this research was done in Matla, Bangladesh. This area is very famous for demographic surveillance that's been happening there since the late 60s. So what we've actually done here, what I'm showing you results from today, is results from a subsample survey, so not from the large data set, which we actually have and we'll be doing work with next, but we're starting with the smaller data set that we collected of 943 surveys. We're actually using a little more than 700 here for reasons I'll talk about later, where we intentionally went in and asked questions that would help us try to test these ideas. The Matlab study area, this is sort of a cross-section of it in Bangladesh, and I'd like you to note the parts in yellow are areas where they've done intensive kinds of intervention, so free contraception, free healthcare, and especially a lot of education of women by other local women. Whereas the green areas are areas in which they've conducted demographic surveillance but have not done these kinds of interventions. This is just a picture of the study area, what it's like in the field. Okay, socioeconomically in this area, by way of a little more background, this is rural Bangladesh. As of 40 or 50 years ago, almost everyone or most people would have been engaged in subsistence agriculture or fishing, or they would have been engaged in a lot of subsistence with some production for the market as well, a mix of those strategies. In this area, in modern times, land ownership is decreasing, primarily related to really strong population growth in this region. You also have access to the labor market increasing with roads going into the area and people now able to take buses or other forms of public transportation to major cities. You also have increasing adoption of wage labor, including labor migration. including to cities in Bangladesh, but also abroad, especially to the Gulf states. This is a majority Muslim population. We do have a minority of Hindus also in the area. They're relatively similar socioeconomically. There are some differences. They don't seem to have much effect on this particular, on fertility, for instance. You have patrilocal residents in baris, or essentially compounds of closely related nuclear or extended families who live very, very close to each other. So even if you're living in a quote-unquote nuclear family, you might be living right next door to other members of your patrilineally related family. Inheritance is traditionally patrilineal in this region. Islam suggests that you give a double share to your sons and a single share to your daughter, or half a share to your daughter, what you give to your sons. In practice, most people who don't have that much money give all of their inheritance to their sons and give things to their daughters if the daughter is destitute or if they can afford to do so. And we have other data on inheritance, which I won't talk about too much today, but we could look at that later. It's in arranged marriage systems. Women rarely work outside the home. This is often true even of highly educated women. It certainly has been true of women with increasing education over the last 40 years. And traditionally, this is an area that's been considered very relatively low socioeconomic status, and also an area in which there has not been tons and tons of socioeconomic variation. It was relatively flat, but of course that's increasing as this area becomes increasingly connected to global labor markets especially. That's probably the #1 driver of this. You also started to get electricity and things like that in the 80s and 90s, though even today, a house like this might be wired into the electric system, but it might receive maybe 6 hours a day of electricity. And so you don't have people who are really relying on those kinds of appliances or other things. So specifically in the field, this is a mixed methods project. I mean, I'm most interested in the quantitative aspects of it, but in order to do this kind of research at best, I thought we needed qualitative data as well, and I'll show you some of that later in the talk. We did 943 surveys. They're very, very, very detailed, long kind of questionnaires. I'd be happy to show anyone a copy of the survey at some point. We did 51 open-ended interviews on topics related to same kinds of topics, so talking for about 90-minute recorded and transcribed interviews. The respondents were women aged 20 to 64. They're a random sample of a population of 250,000 people. About 65,000 of those are women in this age categories. We took equal samples from each of 3 age ranges because there's been rapid population growth, and otherwise we would have had overrepresentation of younger women. Interviews were done in Bengali or Bangla and entered in English. And in this paper, I'm going to be looking at 783 married respondents. We're not looking at unmarried women. Non-marital fertility is very, very low in this population. I actually asked people about this, and even the people who collect the stats said, oh, there's maybe 10. I said 10 last year? No, maybe 10 that I know of. Potentially, there are a lot of very strong social norms about not having sex outside of marriage, but moreover, marriage is early, and if people started to get involved, marriage would probably take place very soon thereafter. The children that these women have, 2,640 children. I should say that this includes some women who do not yet have children, but most of the women with no children have been married a year or 2 at most. So fertility in the area, this is going to be a mixture, and I'll show you of stuff coming from the larger demographic data set and then from our own data, and then I'll show you the actual results we have from our own data. This area, one reason we chose it for this research is because it's still undergoing a very rapid demographic transition, especially in terms of both mortality decline and also fertility decline. You've gone from a TFR of 6.8 children per woman, this is live births, to 2.7 in the last 40 years or just over. So it's been very quick. You have widespread use of contraceptives since the 70s. In this particular talk, I'm going to treat this as part of the strategy or approximate variable rather than a causal one, because everyone has access to contraception. And we know from interviews that people use them in a very deliberate and strategic way, for delaying, for spacing, especially for stopping, but in many ways that women are choosing to use contraception. Also that there's relatively little disapproval of contraception in the population, although except in certain circumstances. So this is from the ICDDRB database, TFR. This is just to show you how the decline looks like. The blue line is the ICDDRB area, the intervention area. The red line is the non-intervention area. We call it the government area. It's the area where you get government services rather than services from ICDDRB. And essentially you can see that fertility has fallen. It's lower, or at least it was lower for a long time, in the intervention area, but you've got a very similar trend going on in the area outside, suggesting a variety of different things: diffusion of information, diffusion of technology, or just general availability in the rest of Bangladesh in terms of technology or motivation for fertility reduction, sort of changing alongside or at least in parallel with what's happening in areas of greater intervention. This is in our study sample, and I'm looking here at women in 5-year increments, from women who are 60 to 64 to women who are 20 to 24. You can see the women who are 60 to 64 were born between 1955 and 1960, so they were born before there was any intervention in this area. They started having children in the early years of the intervention when it was mostly cholera vaccination, and then increasingly were involved as they got older with more and more kinds of interventions. You can see this is surviving children now. It's fallen from 5 down to, I'll show you for the women who are probably completed fertility, 30 to 34. Some of those women may have a few more, but probably not too many of them. So it's gone from 5 to around maybe 2.6 or something like that. And for those of you who like to see error bars, this is the opposite. The scale is exactly the same, but I've shifted the ages. So you can see the heavy black line is the median for these different ages. So if you want to look at women from here up as having, you've got from essentially 5 again to 2, or somewhat greater than 2 being the norm as time has passed. Okay, in this region, a lot of the literature that's focused on this intervention that people have done, rather famously actually, has talked about how this change has been caused by or largely attributed to family planning and health campaign. So there's free health services for women and children, free access to contraception, especially home visits by trained local women who talk about child health education, family planning education, etc. And this intervention has been in the ICDDRB area only, though later on, more limited versions of the intervention were actually used by people in the other areas of Bangladesh as well. And they say that essentially one of the reasons why a lot of people have argued that this area is essentially an example of cultural transmission as a primary mechanism is that economic growth in this area didn't really start to change too much until the 80s and 90s. But a detailed look at the literature and a detailed look at our data suggests that a lot was going on at the same time. There was, of course, mortality reduction, which could also be something that drives fertility decline. There was also, importantly, increasing saturation of arable land, so less and less land that wasn't already under cultivation, and more people in the area, so more division of land. You also have rising prevalence of education, and again, increasing access to wage labor economy. But some of these things were even started going on before the intervention or in the early days of the intervention. So I'd like to look at this a little bit more detail. Just to give you a sense of this, mortality decline from about 120 children per 1,000 dying, largely of infectious disease when they were quite young, to now in the ICDDRB area about 25 children per 1,000 dying. Life expectancy rising rapidly, largely as a result of reduction in infant child mortality. This is men and women here in this case. Women actually outlive men now. They did not in the past. And these are ages of marriage. So you have the age of marriage rising from about 16 and a half to about 20, but that's not nearly enough to account for a decline in fertility from 7 to 2.5. Okay. So I'll show you some results now. My inclusion criteria, again, all married women, including those without children. The outcome variable we're going to look at today, total number of children currently living or surviving past 5. Better measure from an evolutionary perspective, I think, than children ever born. We're using general linear models. Fertility is modeled using a Poisson distribution because it's count data. We also tried a negative binomial, but it essentially looks the same. And the actual thing I'm modeling, if you're curious, because there are some zeros in this, is y minus 1. So child total minus 1 to get the zeros out of there. So what essentially makes people move from one child to the next child. And I'm going to compare models using Akaike information criteria and weights. So the base model here, these are just base things that I'm kind of trying to control for before we look at more causal, potentially causal kinds of variables. So the respondent's age at marriage, and the husband's income. You'll note husband's income has very little effect here. It really doesn't have any effect in almost any models. Respondent's age and respondent's age of marriage have very strong effects. Older respondents have more children. That makes complete sense. And the respondent's age at marriage has a negative effect, as you can see. But these are results that are essentially removed from the rest of the models that I'll show you. So, risk models. I've got the base model up there that's not in bold, and then these are some test variables that we're including, and then at the bottom I have listed some other things that we've tried but have basically made no difference or have closely paralleled the effects but been weaker to something that's already in. So counting the number of child deaths in the natal bari, so that is the bari that you grew up in. The child deaths in the marital bari, that one you actually get a significant effect for. Adult deaths in the natal and marital baris. In earlier versions of this, before we added more variables, we actually got some effect from adult deaths in marital bari, but that went away once we included better controls. Yes, please.
Estimate, is that among betas or just raw slopes?
I think they're raw. Yes, they're raw. I could pull it for sure, but yeah.
Just
Yes,
trying to
please.
figure out what I'm-
No, it makes absolute sense. So the raw estimate, the standard error, z-value, and the p-value for these. Then we looked at food insecurity, whether people, these are in comparison to when you always had enough food, these food variables are. So that's the base case. Occasionally not enough food, frequently not enough food. In both cases, again, we're not really finding an effect here. Number of serious illnesses, again, not too much of an effect. We also tried the number of chronic illnesses, the length of the longest illness, the frequency of childhood illness, etc. So what I'm seeing here, at least so far, with what we've included, child death in the marital bari, that is where you're actually having your children, may have some effect, but the rest of these variables don't seem particularly important. Just to show you, this is the number of children who died in the marital bari. This is the raw data. It's not controlled data, but you can see the trend there. Number of child deaths is along the bottom, and number of children is on the y-axis. This is the other one, adult deaths in a marital bari, and you can see the data is much messier, but you have the same kind of general trend.
Could you go back to the previous one?
Please. Yes.
This is not corrected.
This is not corrected for error. I'd be happy to do those, but
No, just
my data person was like, let's get the final model before I generate, everything. Okay. So investment models now. We can look at this. We're using education of the respondent and the husband here. Rather than using raw education, we're looking at it in categories because it looks like it's a better representation of what's happening after having tried it several ways. So we have respondent 1 to 5 years of education, 6 to 10, and 11 plus. These are in comparison to 0. That's the comparative case. The same thing for husband here. And what we really see from this, that respondents especially who have 11 plus years of education, what in Bangladesh is called above secondary education, you have a really significant, negative effect on fertility, but you can look at this effect size in comparison to the other ones and say that's a pretty strong effect. Half a child, less half a child, that's quite a lot. Husband's education, you see some basic similar kind of trends, negative effects for more education of the husband, but the only thing we have something that's sort of potentially a trend towards significance with a medium level of education. So less happening with the husband. Some variables about where the husband is located. This is a way of indexing labor market participation. There are other ways of doing it, like occupation, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we will. So whether or not the husband is, the base case that these are compared to is the husband actually in Matlab itself, living with the wife. And this is husband in another Bangladesh city, in Dhaka, the capital, which also happens to be quite close to Matlab. And then finally, the husband being abroad. And as you can see, the strongest effect comes from the husband being abroad. This should shock no one. Husbands are not around to inseminate their wives as much. However, when we look at a few other things to see if this is really an effect of reduced potential for impregnation or if it's actually an effect of something else, what we find is the age at first birth for women is the same between women whose husbands are abroad and women whose husbands are not abroad. So I'm not sure if that's really what's going on there or not. Yes?
Do they differ in income then?
They do. They differ dramatically in income. But income is controlled here. They differ dramatically in income. I have some preliminary results from another thing which also suggests that there's radically more parental investment going on in these families where husbands are abroad. Yes?
Do you have birth spacing that you can look at for the husband abroad? I think that would make
We can. We haven't done it yet, but we can. Yes?
Is there a correlation between woman's level of education and her husband's level of education?
There is a correlation, yes. But it's not, I forget what it is. It's like a Pearson R of like 0.5.
I
So
was just wondering if any of the husband effect is canceled out or you're not seeing such a strong effect because you also have the wife's
education in there.
education in there and it correlates. I just wondered if that was
Potentially. We've played around with this some in terms of taking some of the variables out. I know that Mary decided we should put both in, which I suggest means that she felt like there was a reason, that they were not too similar to each other to keep it in, because she's a bit particular about that kind of stuff. And finally, husband inherited land. This is a dummy variable right now. We have very detailed information on land inheritance, but it's very messy because people record land in 5 different kinds of units, and we have to convert everything into those units, and they're not entirely consistent in the area, so it's a big pain to let you know. But this is essentially whether the husband has inherited land or works on land that he will inherit. And so essentially what you see there is an effect of this. If you have more land, you have more children, and if you have less land, you have less children. And I'll actually show you what this looks like. We've also tried education costs. They don't do anything, and they have our sample size for a variety of reasons. We've also looked at marriage costs of respondents and husband, which is a direct form of investment. In many cases, some parts of the marriage cost are at least in the family that is starting, and that there's no effect of that either. So just to show you, this is the effect of the respondent's education. The results for husband's education look quite similar. You can see the median lines. Respondents with, this is 0 is no education, primary, secondary, and above secondary you can see that there's a pretty noticeable decrease. The husband's location, you can also see, again, this is home. Another city in Bangladesh and Dhaka, pretty similar. And then abroad, this effect. Again, the question exactly where that comes from, but we're going to try to make sure that it's actually some kind of effect rather than just the husband's not around. Okay. Owns or uses land. The top one doesn't own or use inherited land, so you're essentially landless. Total children, as you can see, 1 is the mode. Then owns or uses inherited land, the mode is 4 children. That's quite a big difference. We've been working with this recently. There might be some more controls needed, but she's looked at husband's age and some other things, and we know if the husband is going to inherit or not, and this is what we're seeing so far.
There's no sharecropping?
There's tons of sharecropping, but this is in cases not of sharecropping.
So the guys
The guys up top would be sharecroppers.
sharecroppers.
Or they might, yes, exactly. But this is just if you own any land. So these guys could be doing both. But this is, they have some owned land, but there's definitely sharecropping. And we have data on sharecropping too, but we haven't looked at it yet. So, cultural transmission. I took this to PAA a few months ago, 2 months ago, an earlier version of this. And they all said, you haven't tested cultural transmission very well. And I said, okay, I'm coming to UCLA, I better do some more cultural transmission testing. All right, so what do we have right now? And I have a whole another paper of discussion of what's not in here and what isn't here. But let's look at what I have in here. Distance from natal to marital, Bari. This is one version of us trying to get this idea of kin influence. Women visit their families very frequently if they live nearby. We know women spend, that's the number one reason why women leave their homes is to visit family. If you live closer, you visit them a lot more. You also have kin, paternal, I mean, it's sort of your husband's kid living in the Bari with you. So we don't see an effect of that. The number of people who are in the marital Bari, that's the one where you're having children who are abroad, they're not in your family, not the ones in your family who might be sending you money, but the ones who just live somewhere in the Bari and who might be importing ideas in various ways as they visit or as they communicate with people. Again, not really seeing an effect there. Whether or not husband uses a mobile phone, we also looked at wife, but the effect for husband was a much stronger effect, so we've used the husband's effect as well. And you can see that, actually this should probably also be a minus. This is a non-significant result, but I think it should be a minus there. Husband often uses a mobile phone, and husband very often uses a mobile phone, are both giving us fewer children. Potentially, this is a cultural transmission effect. Respondent visits Matlab town. I know we're in this area, but it's actually quite difficult to get from some remote areas to the actual town of Matlab. If you visit more than once yearly as a woman, so this is the respondent, women frequently stay in their baris most of the time. We found an effect that used to be significant. It's not anymore once we put some more variables in, but are leaving it in here because it has some importance. Intervention area or not, we have an effect for that. In the intervention area, of course, you're having lower fertility, ideally, presumably, at least in part, that could be because of the interventions themselves. And the interventions, as I've discussed, they have these practical elements, but they're very heavy on transmission of information. And then we've got respondents' education in there coded in the same way compared to respondents with no education. And in this case, you can see with the different set of variables, we actually see a negative effect that's significant of women in 6 to 10 years of education, not just women with post-secondary education. Now, what else have we attempted here? This is a list. We've looked at number of people in the natal Bari who are living abroad, so people who are living abroad when you were a child who could have had some kind of influence, not your family, but people in your neighborhood essentially. We've looked at respondent and husband's exposure to TV, radio, newspapers, books, posters, and billboards. Most of these effects, we find some effect for TV, but it doesn't improve the model when compared with the ones that just use the mobile phone in there. So the TV actually looks like there's some effect, though it duplicates the mobile phone one. The other ones, there's virtually no effect. And this is potentially, I mean, women may be due in the case of women to lack of variance. A lot of women just don't read books or newspapers even if they're able to read. The other kinds of things are advertisements, posters, and billboards are on there because there's a lot of family planning messages which are disseminated like that. But again, we're not seeing too much of an effect, though we might independently look at these kinds of things later. Whether the husband has visited Matlab, whether the respondent or husband has visited Dhaka, actually there is an effect of those, but the effect of the Matlab visits by respondents was a much stronger effect in the same direction. So in order to keep this in order to not disadvantage this too much in the weight comparisons, I'll show you in a minute, we're not putting everything in that we can. It has an effect, but again, it's not significant once you put the variables in that we're including. Yep.
Sorry, one quick question. So the posters and billboards, was the question framed like how often have you noticed these things, or
Just
how often are they in the town they were living in?
how often have you seen them?
Okay.
And is there much variation in that? I mean,
Well,
is that
Well, this is one of the
variation
problems.
so that
With the
we-
respondent, no. With the respondent's husband, there's more variation. And it has to do a lot of times with the kind of work that he does, if it's mobile or not. So we could do more detailed exploration of that later. We also had a couple of variables that we tested in another paper, which we were thinking about for can influence number of household members, both natal and marital. What we find here is not ideally, if you think this model is good, the more kin around you, the more children you should have, but we actually find a negative effect, in some cases a very strong negative effect, which is much more indicative of kin competition in this case, or local resource competition. We'll be doing more focusing on that in another paper to try to tease out what's causing that, who the kin are, who you're competing with. A number of household members living outside MATLAB. Again, this idea, so this is household members. The problem is here, or the reason why it's not in this model anymore, is that it has a clear positive effect, which is again against the prediction here. And so I just am not incorporating it here, but this can suggest some kind of effect of wealth instead of an effect of cultural transmission.
You're controlling for husband's income.
I'm controlling for husband's income. So there are sometimes are other members of the household besides the husband.
And you don't have a household income
I can make one, yes. Yeah. We have income for about 6 people. I could show it to you. Yeah. This one is a little bit of a complicated thing, and I feel like I need to do some work just on that to understand what's going on, that particular variable. So just to show you a couple of the graphs. This is government service area on top, ICDDRB intervention area on the bottom, and you can see the main difference is going from, the people in the government service area are much more likely to go to have 4, 5, 6 children. The people in the ICDDRB area are less likely to have those higher numbers of children. They mostly have 2 or 3, which is what you'd expect with a TFR of 2.7. This is, again, respondents' education. We've seen this before. It's the exact same graph, but just to remind you, this is an effect that we see, except we've got, I should have starred this, the secondary one is significant in the case of this cultural transmission model. We have husband's mobile phone use. This is hard to see in the raw data. You can see it with very high fertility going down. But I think the adjustment is what makes clear how much of whether or not they're significant. Again, the high and very high are significant results. Okay. This is another one. Respondent has visited MATLAB Town. Not significant in the current version, but various versions of this are interesting. And you can see the median is the same, but you have a decreased spread in the data. And then this is the one, this sort of strange result that I told you, or this kind of negative result that's no longer included, in which the number of current or marital household members outside of MATLAB increases the number of children you have. Okay, so let's show you the results of the model comparison. This is, I'll do 2 model comparisons. So just in its current form, these 4 models, base plus risk predictors, base plus parental investment predictors, base plus cultural transmission predictors. You can see the AICs, lower AICs are better. The models are also penalized for adding variables that have limited predictive value, so we've tried to not add too many of the variables with really small predictive value. We're trying to keep the models to ones with more. And you can see that the parental investment model, in this particular case, at least in this specification, has the strongest amount of weight behind it. However, you can looking at the different models, that there are a lot of variables out there that are important. And so parental investment by itself, comparing these, may be one thing to do. But the other thing that's interesting here is getting a sense of what's a best model look like and what kind of causes is it potentially drawing on. And so I'm going to show you a comparison to a best model for fertility decline that we put together by essentially, this is a first estimate. We need to finish things before we're going to do a final one, where we're just essentially putting together the strongest predictors from each model. So mostly the significant predictors, and this is what we see. The best model is clearly the strongest in this case. Parental investment still gets some weight, and cultural transmission gets some weight. Base plus risk, and I should show you this in both cases, the risk model is actually worse than the base model because it's got all these variables in it that aren't particularly predictive. And that may be because we need to get some better variables. We do have many other variables, but they're not ready yet. Okay. So preliminarily, from looking at this, it looks like investment models are better predictors than other evolutionary models compared directly. This is consistent with previous work by, I have a paper with a very sketchy methods compared to this. Method's the same, that the variables are really limited. Collaborator of mine on the grant has a dissertation research. Ruth Mace has some stuff, though she doesn't really compare cultural transmission too much with us directly, in which variables that I'm including under investment are the ones that seem to be the best predictors in all of these cases. So this could potentially mean the investment models are tapping into more powerful causal mechanisms, or perhaps more prior causal mechanisms. But the best model clearly includes multiple different kinds of predictors, and that's probably going to be true even when we've got everything completely ironed out. So a full explanation of the transition is likely to be multi-causal. Now, in the last couple of 10 minutes, I'd like to discuss some complications of this analysis, primarily one particular complication, which probably some of you are already aware of. Okay. Some of the key variables we're using here, and I'm going to use education as a primary predictor. I'm also thinking about husband's location here. Maybe markers of both investment and cultural transmission. There may be other ones that are markers of multiple things as well, but these are the most glaring ones. And teasing out relative effects is tricky. I'm including the wife's education in both the investment models and in the cultural transmission models. And we've looked at it, and essentially what it looks like is the education variables themselves are part of what's driving the strength of the investment model, but in fact the land variable is one of the stronger things that's driving that effect, and one of the reasons it makes it a stronger model. But we have these other effects, which again are a little bit difficult to interpret. So I'm going to talk about two ways that one could potentially start to address this problem, other than what we're already doing, and that is trying to put variables in the best places. And that is path analysis, and I'm also going to talk about some preliminary qualitative findings and what they suggest about this about this question. So this is a very early version of a path analysis that my student Chris Atkinson has been working on, and there's various caveats involved with this. Basically what this is we've created a factor based on a series of cultural transmission variables. These are 3, radio, TV, and husband phone, and we could actually use this posters and billboards things too, but they're not as strong. They create a very good factor together very easily. And we sort of take this factor, this is the Cronbach's alpha, and we regress it on respondents' education. So this is, again, what explains education. We could do this with child's education. We're using respondents in this case as a proxy to give you a sense of how this would work more than this is the result. This is more like how it would work this. For investment, the idea with this kind of thing is you want to find some predictors to make the factors that are really not the complicated ones. So you don't want to use education to predict education. You want to use something that's as far as you can get away from it. So we have these cultural transmission variables, which I'm fairly comfortable with. The ones we have for investment, the problem we were having is we have this investment in wedding variables. We have these other investment, how much time parents spend with their children. We have this other stuff for land. But the problem with it is that at least the ones that we were trying a few days ago when he was trying to finalize this, they weren't actually forming a factor together. So I'm showing you one that actually forms a factor, but there's only 2 variables in it, so it's a little bit problematic. But you can still see, at least so far, what's happening in terms of results. So you get this Cronbach's alpha of 6.610. Ideally, it would be higher, but that's what we have right now. And these are beta, so these are standardized coefficients here, negative 0.082 and 0.229. And this is a positive, not a negative. Yeah, this is, it's a reverse-coded variable, and he left this negative mark in there, and I was looking at it earlier thinking, that's wrong. No, okay, so these are betas. So this is an estimate that we have so far about relative effect. Relative effect, the cultural transmission vector is loading at about 1/3 of the relative effect size of the investment variables. Now, we're not controlling for tons of things, et cetera here, but essentially we're hoping to do some work with these kind of modeling to try to see if we can get a sense of how much a weight we're going to get for something like education, which we know has multiple motivations, if we can get at multiple motivation through this kind of thing. But this is sort of a very preliminary version. This, by the way, this 0.789 is the amount of variation in education we are not explaining with this model. So lots, yeah.
Mary, why don't you use, why isn't income?
In investment, be happy to put it there. I guess the reason it's not in there right now is I've been gun shy of including in, actually there's probably less of a reason why it couldn't be here in education. It probably should be here. I'm leaving it as a control and not a predictor in the rest of it because the relationship between income and fertility is a complicated one. I don't think that there is an a priori prediction from that. Because in traditional societies, wealthier people have more children. In modern societies, they might or might not. And some people have said it within narrow social strata. But yes, in here, we probably should put it.
Particularly since your cultural transmission items look like they cost money.
Yes, they do. Okay, I mean, for our other use. Okay, so it should be in this or in there. Where should it be?
No, somewhere.
Okay. This is really early. Really early, so this will become much better, but I wrote that down. Okay.
But typically income lowers fertility, right?
It does in modern social environments. It does not do anything to fertility in this area.
Well,
It's flat.
well, you showed us that table, that regression table, with a bunch of covariates.
Mm-hmm.
What helped you actually along the lines in doing this kind of path analysis is to do it in steps where you actually show the direct effect of something like income.
Yep.
Because it goes away, it doesn't mean it's not important.
Mm-hmm. I see, but it's acting through other variables, yes.
That's right.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
it could be that it's actually an ultimate cause.
Yep.
And something like cell phone use
Yep.
or approximate manifestation of that. Those are being.
Yep. Yep. Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's surprising that you get it's the PhD washes out.
In the other models it does, but you're right. You're right. With this kind of thing, we could actually look at why that is, what it's acting through. It's acting through something, presumably.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'll just finish in a few minutes by showing you some qualitative evidence. And I'm going to look at these with these little codes I, C, T, and R, investment, cultural transmission, and income kinds of motivations. And I'm going to show you some quotes. And you can see what you think about this. So a student of mine, Rosalind Fraser, who's in the field with me, she's an interpretive sociologist. She does this very qualitative research. So she was working on something for a different paper. And so she examined all people's motivations for a smaller family size, what they say about the number of children they want and why they want it. So this was unconnected with my theoretical ideas about this. She pulled, and these were the main four, she was using grounded theory, and these are the main four codes or ideas that she pulled out of all the answers to our qualitative questions on this topic. So 4 main causes of smaller fertility. 1, increasing expense of raising children properly nowadays. So this includes things like food is more expensive, which you could argue is more investment related, but it also includes things like children need to go to school and children need uniforms and books, which are very much cultural transmission kind of ideas. Property or inheritance issues that focus more on kinds of investment ideas. Increased workload for the mother in raising more children. This is a harder one for me. I'll show you some quotes. You can tell me what you think, how much of this might be something that's more cultural transmission versus investment. And then what she was calling cultural and moral reasons, I would use it differently, but I'm using her terminology here so I can show you this is as a category, and I'll show you some quotes from each of these sections. So I'll just kind of look at one quote from each. You can read them if you want. So most respondents now say they want 2 children, and they relate this to how expensive it is to have more children. So I'll read the second one, some more complicated. By having 2 children, I can take care of them properly, can spend enough money for their education. Again, this complicated variable. Today our income is limited, but the demand of life has increased. Part of that from other interviews we know is prices have increased, but part of that is what people want. So it is necessary to have 2 children so that we can give them all the things that they want / need. If there are more children, then there is more expense. This is an example. You get some of these that kind of focus more on we can give them more food, we can give them medicine. You can give other ones that focus more on things that they want in a more cultural way. Smaller family size, land ownership, property transmission. If we have fewer children, then the land will be less divided. This comes up. I think 1 boy and 1 girl are good because if I have a son, more sons than 1 son, then my land will be divided into many pieces. But if I have 1 boy, then all the land will be undivided. My entire land goes to my son. So things about property really tend to focus on lack of division. Yes?
When I say this, and so I'm interested in, I was just thinking about this risk argument which drops out. So could it be that this may only reflect the qualitative, not the quantitative, but if you can assume your kids are going to grow up,
Yes.
you can plan on that's, I guess.
And we may have gotten to that point where we can. But there's actually, I'd be happy to talk to you this more about later. There's this really, really, really fascinating thing going on with risk. It just doesn't seem to be heavily related to fertility. We have a whole paper on perceptions of risk that would be very interesting. I could actually talk to you about that more. I have 1 quote about risk in a minute though. Okay, smaller family size. Respondents say it's easier to manage a family. This is what women say over and over. What do you mean by manage a family? I normally clean the house, wash the dishes, cook for the family, raise the cows, and all post-harvesting activities like separating the rice from the plant, boiling and drying the rice, etc., etc. Whereas I have a lot of work. More children means more work. And this is a traditional context, raising cows and boiling rice. That's interesting. But then we have other ones taking care of mother and father-in-law. But again, this would have been true in the past as well. I don't know. I don't see tons of cultural transmission here, but presumably there really could be in this kinds of argument. Let's look at this, probably in some ways one of the more interesting ones. What Roslin calls social and moral reasons. If I have fewer children, I can take care of them. I can give them all the things they want, and I can expend enough money for their education, food, clothes, and make them good human beings, manushkora, which means doing people. Okay, interesting. This is, I would say, quite cultural transmission type of thing, some investment. This one is one that gets into risk. Everyone wants to keep their families small because many children can break the mother's health. This is one of the things that education has been about, but there's also, people view it objectively because they know older women who had a lot of children and they talk about their problems. Many children are not only bad for the mother's health, but also for the country. This is an interesting idea. If people cannot control the population increases, which can produce bad manner of people and incite terror. I would not say that mother's health argument is much more common than inciting terror kind of idea. That was her own idea, but this is, again, a sort of perception of risk idea. It's not quite so common, but you see it sometimes. Okay. And finally, a little bit about education. Parents tell us they want their children to have as much education as possible. If you ask, in fact, it was a useless question to ask, how much education do you want your child to have? I want them to be a doctor. People wouldn't even, the answer was all the same, as much as possible. But education is valued for ability to help people in getting a job, especially one that has a stable income, which farming is not seen as doing, or high income. However, the major reason people drop out of school is because they lose interest and stop going to school, and their parents essentially can't do anything about it or don't feel like it's within their purview to do anything about it. So I'll give you a few quotes. None of my sons have much education, so can I expect better jobs for them? They are now working in the field as farmers or grocers. If they had enough education, then I would prefer that they get a government service job because it has a pension and is a secure job. This is a sort of a South Asian thing. It's true in other places too. Look at a couple of other ones. How can I say how much education children should receive? I want them to receive higher education, but if they're not interested, what can I do? I had this dream that my older son would take the SSC examination, that is 10th grades. So what can I do if they're not attentive in study? In other words, there's nothing I can do about this. More middle-class families might have more ability to control their children's educational attainment, but in rural areas, this is seen as more limited, especially among poorer families. I have no financial difficulties with sending my children to school, but my children were not attentive in study and were not interested in school. So my eldest sons did not want to go, and they left school at grade 5 and grade 3. This is an interesting kind of thing. Education here being seen as something that has these very instrumental motivations, income and income security, but also as something that's sort of on some level up to the individual. This is especially true for boys. So the labor market in Bangladesh may be part of the reason for this idea. Certain high-income professional occupations require education, but you can get lots of jobs with no education. And in fact, a lot of the men going abroad or working in Dhaka only have 4 or 5 years. So they're seen as ways of earning income and the status that goes along with that without education as a primary trajectory. And so one quote, there are good effects on people leaving the village for work. Today people earn lots of money and buy land, again, this very investment kind of thing, build new houses. Now they can eat good food and have good clothes and try to change their way of living. Someone has enough money and people give him respect. Again, reflecting both of these kinds of motivations, especially investment and cultural transmission, mixed together. Okay, so I think this is what I'm taking from this preliminarily, from this kind of way of looking at some of these complicated variables. So from what people say, their intense focus on instrumental kinds of investment-related motivations, that this may be a more primary cause in this area. So either it may be a stronger cause or it may have come first or both. Investment is talked about in education for labor, very specifically for marriage market in some cases. In the case of daughters, I haven't gone into that much, but it's relatively consistent with this. Labor migration for purposes of income. This is, again, the point. But after that, the fact that the ideas from investment and cultural transmission are so mingled in the way that respondents talk about these things, I think that it's quite likely that these effects are occurring in tandem, whether or not they started that way and regardless of what the actual balance in terms of motivation is. So Kaplan argues earlier that while increased investment in body capital may reduce fertility, cultural transmission of low fertility ideals could exaggerate this effect, creating a more dramatic fertility decline. And this is someone coming from a very investment type of perspective. But just having reread some part of Not by Genes Alone, I would say this is reflected in some of the arguments made there as well. And so essentially the combination of the two, or maybe even three in some cases, though I'm not sure what's going on with risk in this case yet, may be necessary to really understand what's going on here, and maybe in other places, though that has yet to be determined. There's a few things we're doing in the future. We want to add some more variables. We have a few more variables that we don't have them in yet, especially a few risk variables that are going to be very intensive to calculate. We need to focus on specifications for models and make sure we're doing it right. Ideally, you can give me some advice on this. We also have this much larger set of data with many fewer variables, and I'd like to try to replicate the basics of the analysis there to see if we're getting the same kinds of results or something else with this massive sample of people, but with maybe only a few good variables. And then again, look further into the path analysis to look at causality that way, do something much more complex than the little piece that I showed you there. And I've got a few projects with different people that may look at this social network analysis stuff, effects of kin on fertility, and we have some detailed information about communication about contraception that would be interesting, who gives what kind of advice. That's it.